Good afternoon. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this speaker series event, The Risks of Politicizing Humanitarian Action, the UNRWA Perspective, a conversation with Pierre Krähenbühl, Commissioner General of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. Appointed by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Pierre Krähenbühl became Commissioner General in March 2014. A Swiss national, he has over 25 years of experience in humanitarian, human rights, and development work. Prior to joining UNRWA, he served as Director of Operations at the International Committee of the Red Cross from 2002 to 2014. In this position, he directly oversaw the organization's response to conflicts in Afghanistan, Colombia, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, among others. His experience also includes field assignments in a variety of contexts, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, El Salvador, and Peru. This conversation, as I'm sure you all are aware, comes at a pivotal moment for UNRWA and for the Palestinian people. On June 25th, just a few days from now, UNRWA will hold its annual pledging conference. This follows what the Commissioner General has called the most severe funding crisis in UNRWA history, after the U.S. ended its long-standing financial contributions to the agency in 2018. Curiously, on the same day, the U.S.-led Peace to Prosperity Economic Workshop, which is meant to encourage investment in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, will convene in Manama, Bahrain. Meanwhile, the dangerous cycles of conflict escalation and de-escalation between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants continue. This spring, thousands of Palestinians participated in weekly demonstrations at the Gaza perimeter fence, leading to what Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Nikolai Mladenov, called the most serious escalation since 2014, with 650 rockets fired from Gaza over a 48-hour period in May, and Israeli Defense Forces striking over 300 Palestinian targets. The situation remains delicate. It is, to say the least, a challenging operational environment, and one where the risks of politicizing humanitarian action are high. This question of how to safeguard principled humanitarian action based in international humanitarian law is one that is at the heart of IPI's program in international humanitarian affairs. Recently, IPI has conducted studies on safeguarding healthcare and humanitarian action in UN counterterrorism framework and under various sanctions regimes. Established by the General Assembly mandate in 1949, UNRWA serves some 5 million Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, providing education, health, microfinance, and relief and social services. What lessons does UNRWA provide for the provision of humanitarian assistance and protection in highly politicized environments? While the UNRWA case is in many respects sui generis, the politicization of humanitarian action is a general challenge we are seeing in multiple contexts, in particular in relation to the proliferation of counterterrorism measures globally. Thus, we are fortunate to have Commissioner General Krähenbühl here to share with us his wide experience. He will speak for about 15 minutes, and then I may take the opportunity to ask a couple questions from the stage, after which we should have plenty of time for Q&A. Commissioner Pierre, welcome back to IPI. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam, thanks very much for the warm words of welcome. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you today and to have an opportunity for an exchange on these really important topics that also mean a great deal to me personally because of the many years of working in humanitarian environments in conflict zones with the International Committee of the Red Cross and now with UNRWA. Let me begin by saying that humanitarian action, humanitarian work, was born on the battlefield. And battlefields are ugly places. And when one reflects back to the person who is credited for having created the foundations and the basis for much of what is today the contemporary forms of humanitarian action, Henri Dunant, was a bit of an improbable character because as a Swiss businessman, he essentially stumbled over one of the most dramatic battlefields of the north of Italy, a place called Solferino, on the 25th of June, 1859, so almost exactly 160 years ago. And he was actually there because he was trying to reach Napoleon III, who happened to be engaged in this conflict alongside Sardinian forces. So you had the Franco-Sardinian side of the battle against the Austrian forces on the other side. And on that day, when Henri Dunant arrived on the battlefield of Solferino, he saw the result of the battle. 6,000 dead and 40,000 injured lying on the battlefield. And what he did at that moment were two things that remain remarkable until this very day in terms of actions that you can take. So the first thing is he acted on the ground. He was not himself a medical person. He mobilized predominantly women from the neighboring communities and villages around Solferino and the battlefield, nurses and others to come and help and provide the urgently needed assistance to the people who were suffering the consequences of this battle. But then he was not content to leave it with one individual response on the ground. He returned to Geneva and started what we would call today mobilizing the state actors or the equivalents of that time, and brought about the drafting of what became the very first Geneva Convention for the improvement of the treatment of injured and wounded soldiers on the battlefield. And so through his actions, he not only laid the foundations of what is today known as international humanitarian law, but also of the creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, of national societies of Red Cross and Red Crescent, all of whom are still 160 years on, very proud responders in some of the most difficult conflict zones of today. Now, in the meantime, of course, what has changed profoundly since the time that Henri Dunant came across the battlefield of Solferino is the nature of warfare, the types of actors that you find in the battlefields and in the conflict zones of today. What Henri Dunant witnessed was still very much what we today come to think of maybe classic forms of armed conflict, the open field, 2 or 3 armies facing each other on that open field and engaging in warfare. And as I indicated, 6,000 dead, 40,000 injured. On that particular day in Solferino, 1 civilian was recorded as among the victims of that particular clash. Of course, today, when you work in war zones, you have a completely different proportion of civilians to soldiers, of combatants to civilians injured or killed in today's wars. We also have what used to be predominantly forms of warfare between states and official structured armed forces. We have shifted to conflicts predominantly within states, so-called non-international or internal armed conflicts, characterized not only by their great fragmentation, but the multiplicity of actors that are there on the ground. At least when I was director of operations of the ICRC, I remember that in the case, for example, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, we had to deal with about 45 to 50 different armed groups just simply in the east of the DRC, and I'm sure that it's still very much the case today, updated the knowledge there, but that certainly this fragmentation, the multiplicity of actors, the fact that you have so many non-state armed groups is a defining feature. Another defining feature of the conflicts of today is their very long duration. You come to think of how many conflicts that come to your mind that have now been in existence for at best a decade, and at worst, and we're certainly an example of operating in that one, in UNRWA, 7 decades with the Israeli, Arab and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, But you can think of what happened in Colombia, that was 5 decades, and Afghanistan, it's 4 decades, etc. So the long duration and the difficulty to end these conflicts is one of the key parameters of today. Now, when working as an aid agency in these environments of conflict, you realize, of course, that it is an extremely tough commitment. It requires resolve, it requires determination, it requires a lot of humility, but also courage. And I say this without any of the heroics that are sometimes associated with humanitarian actions. I don't believe in that very much. Some may hold a somewhat romantic view of humanitarian work with the image of the aid worker arriving in his shining or her shining vehicle to save the victim, to general applause. That's very rarely the way it works. And of course, it is mainly a very lonely, sometimes extremely scary line of work to be engaged in. As I said, the reality is very different, and one thing that I can say with absolute certainty is that I cannot recall a single situation that I have worked in over these years where the actors of the conflict would spontaneously welcome the presence of the humanitarian organizations, be they state actors or non-state actors. And here I have to say that there's, of course, a very big difference between states and others encouraging humanitarian work when this is taking place in a context that you're not involved in, versus, of course, the situation of having humanitarian actors present in a situation where you are yourself as a country involved. There's a fundamental difference of behavior. And contrary to what we may very often hear, there is no such thing as a pre-existing or predetermined humanitarian space in conflict zones. It doesn't exist. You will never, as a humanitarian actor, drive up in one of your contexts and see a sign by the side of the road saying, "Welcome to the humanitarian space." Humanitarian space is something that you create, and it's hard work to create them. I want to say here that it, first of all, requires dialogue with all. As a fundamental paradigm of the humanitarian imperative is that you accept that when you work in conflict zones, you will be talking to all. Otherwise, there is no space to create the response that humanitarian organizations are about. It also requires, in order to create the humanitarian space, very strict adherence to the fundamental humanitarian principles: neutrality, independence, impartiality, humanity. There are different ones, but let me just today focus on the importance of probably the most misunderstood of all of the fundamental principles of humanitarian action, which is neutrality. Neutrality is crucial because what it means and what it entails is the fundamental consideration that you're not, as an organization or as an individual, taking sides in the confrontation. And that is the misunderstood part, because it sounds sometimes like neutrality is a reflex of taking a step back, of physically moving away from the battlefield or from the consequences. It is also neutrality very often misunderstood for indifference to what is happening, when in fact, neutrality is absolutely crucial as an access-enabling and action-enabling principle. If the Red Cross or other organizations are able to work in Kandahar, it is because they embrace neutrality. If the Red Cross is able to visit prisoners in Guantanamo, it is because they embrace neutrality. And the same can be said for the work that I carried out in places like Grozny or today in Gaza. But neutrality, the other side of it that is often misunderstood, is that neutral does not mean that I'm not in favor of the other one, but I agree with you. That is not neutrality. Neutrality means I do not take sides. Therefore, I am here in this conflict environment, and I have neither the need to be in favor of you or the other side. That is not always the part that is the most attractive to conflict actors. When I spoke to a senior commander in the Shining Path movement in Peru, in my early years with the International Committee of the Red Cross, I was very directly challenged by him saying, I do not believe in neutrality. I don't think there is such a thing as neutrality in a conflict environment. It isn't possible in human terms to not be on one side or the other. I knew, however, that I would never be having this conversation with this commander of the Shining Path if I had not embraced neutrality. There was no way of coming out of that conflict environment alive if it was perceived that I was choosing a side in that confrontation. The same crossing front lines in Afghanistan. When you leave the last checkpoint before the no man's land and you look in the eyes of the person at that checkpoint wondering why it is a good idea to allow you to go to the other side and come back, it is only because this person develops over time, never the first time, the conviction that you will not share strategically sensitive information about their military locations with the other side. And how does this person know it? Only because when you came back from that side, you didn't actually share anything with him about what you saw on the other side. And it is this engagement, it is this resolute adherence to neutrality that allows you to do this. And this is why when I went to Aleppo 2 years ago to thank the 240 Palestinian staff that we have in Aleppo in UNRWA for keeping the schools and health centers open throughout the war, I knew that that was possible also because they embraced and we embraced neutrality. Now this, in addition to dialogue with all and adherence to these principles, it is very important also that, of course, humanitarian organizations are measured against the quality and relevance of the response to needs. If you have a strong alignment between what you say and what you do, you create trust and you can work, but it takes years sometimes to develop that, and you can lose, of course, that trust in an afternoon. Now, turning to the specific point of politicization of humanitarian work, it's not, of course, only the actions of humanitarian organizations that influence their ability to operate. Parties to a conflict, and be they state or non-state actors, play a very crucial role. They can either enable or facilitate work or interfere and prevent it from happening. And as I just described, humanitarian action takes place in some of the most polarized and politicized environments on the planet. Now, in my experience, there are two forms of politicization that have significant impact on humanitarian organizations. One are forms of rejection of humanitarian action, and the other is a form of instrumentalization of humanitarian work. And let me just give you an example of my personal experience in the context post 9/11 with the deployment of Western armies to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe to start with Afghanistan. These deployments entailed significant risks for humanitarian organizations that are often perceived in their essence, though I think sometimes wrongly, but perceptions count and matter, to be Western in their essence themselves. So having Western armed forces deploy in a context where you as a humanitarian actor are perceived to be predominantly Western in essence entails significant risks. These risks were reinforced by actions and communications by the international forces. For example, and this was very strongly the case in European countries that were involved in Afghanistan, they would present their deployments in Afghanistan as being humanitarian interventions. This was a way of not saying to their own populations, we are going to war. It was more easy to present it as we are engaging in humanitarian interventions. Other armed forces, the US, the UK, and many others, were engaged in so-called hearts and minds operations, where in addition to waging war, you would bring humanitarian assistance and provide this assistance to the communities. You can see the rationale from the perspective of the state actor saying, I engage militarily, but I also think of the needs of the people. But never forget that from a humanitarian point of view, there's one very fundamental difference between this deployment of the armed forces and how they engage in humanitarian aid and what a humanitarian organization does, and that is that however an army will present its humanitarian contribution, it will always remain as a constituent part of a strategy to defeat an enemy. Always. And therefore, if any impression emerges that a humanitarian organization, which is there based on its independence and neutrality, is operating in a context where it would gradually be drawn into a strategy to defeat an enemy, then your security and all the rest of your work is at great risk of being embroiled in this form of politicization of humanitarian aid. And I recall until this day leaflets that were dropped on Afghan villages by international forces which said, in exchange for information about the whereabouts of senior leaders of the opposition or the Taliban, we will provide humanitarian aid to your villages. This is a creation of a blurring of lines of distinction between what humanitarian action is about and what political military action is about that has serious implications. In other words, again, the neutrality is a crucial element here. Now, from an UNRWA perspective, all of these parameters are also, of course, at play in different ways. The whole issue of neutrality and the risks of politicization apply to UNRWA very clearly. As was mentioned by Adam, we were tasked by the General Assembly in 1949 and began operations in May 1950 to assist the then 750,000 Palestine refugees in the areas that are still UNRWA's areas of operation today, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. And that means that we operate today still in one of the most polarized and politicized environments on the planet. What is unusual in the UNRWA case is that we were tasked by the General Assembly to focus our support and our activities on one community. That is a very rare experience because normally humanitarian organizations that operate in a conflict environment will assess the different needs in different communities in ways that are fully impartial. Here the mandate was designed by the community of states in such a way, and that reinforces the need for us to focus on neutrality, even, I would say, more strongly. It makes it all the more essential. It's a very demanding context, and I'll just give an example. 2 years ago, during repair works to one of our schools, to two of our schools in the Gaza Strip, we discovered that tunnels had been dug that didn't have an exit point or entry point within our school grounds, but tunnels had been built by Hamas below the schools. What we made very clear, first of all, we found out. We informed the different parties of this. We condemned Hamas publicly for it and contributed to sealing the tunnels. So this is just to illustrate to what extent and how far UNRWA is prepared to go to protect and preserve the neutrality and not allow any actor, for that matter, in the region to play with its installations, to undermine its credibility, its legitimacy. And when you work in a war zone, that is extremely demanding, as we have conducted training on neutrality issues for all of our staff and will continue to do so. This is interesting because it's something that many donors will also expect of UNRWA to do, that we uphold in this very demanding context this principle of neutrality. And the irony of it is that we have, over the last 18 months, seen increased politicization around UNRWA, which is, of course, contradictory with the very request addressed to us to safeguard neutrality, when, in fact, we are being pushed ever more into politicization. And here I just want to highlight, what do I mean by this? Well, the decision by the United States to cut funding to UNRWA in January last year, I describe it always, and I'll describe it here again, as an absolute sovereign decision by a member state of the General Assembly, perfectly entitled to determine if, and if so at what level or not, a government wishes to support a humanitarian organization like UNRWA. That is not what is the issue for me. We regretted very much, of course, the loss of income. It was very severe, and we lost another 60 million from the United States this year. But the point here is not about the decision on funding. It's the accompanying narrative that has been developed, suggesting somehow that UNRWA is a key actor in perpetuating the situation of refugeehood of Palestinians. And somehow, therefore, the implication is that we are contributing to perpetuating the conflict. On this, I have been very clear on other occasions. I want to repeat it here. I don't think that stands the test of any serious review. I think it is well known to everyone that it is the actions, or in a sense, the political inaction, and not the actions of humanitarian organizations, that contributes in all contexts around the planet to the unresolved, long-lasting conflicts that we deal with. And as just a reminder, nobody in UNRWA ever expected us to be around for 70 years. Neither did Palestine Refugees, who at the outset were certainly the least interested in having UNRWA to be a long-term actor, since that would always suggest that a political solution that would be inclusive of their aspirations and rights had not been found. So I did want to highlight this. There are many other examples that one can give in this regard, and these are the risks of politicization. And that's why we've appealed in many fora and meetings that member states of the General Assembly also help us to depoliticize the environment, because it is not in the interest of those who need our services, neither it is in the interest of UNRWA or others, that we be caught in and torn apart by these types of extremes of politicization. We commit to neutrality, but we do call on others to ensure and preserve what is one of the multilateral institutions created after World War II that continues to fulfill, we believe, a very necessary and essential service. And I can only illustrate it in closing by the one thing that I feel the most passionate about in the work that we do, and it's our education work. I quote Gordon Brown, "There is not a single other actor in the humanitarian system that runs an entire education service for over 500,000 boys and girls. And if you close your eyes 1 second and you think of all the things that come to your mind when you think of Gaza, violence, conflict, blockade, rocket firing, airstrikes, and whatever else comes to your mind, the one thing that doesn't come to your mind is that we have a student parliament in the Gaza Strip that represents 280,000 boys and girls, the president of which is a 15-year-old girl. That is not the image that you have in mind when you think of Gaza. And yet that is exactly what we are struggling and committed to preserve: gender equality in our schools, a focus on human rights education, conflict intolerance. And of course, this doesn't come without its controversies, but it's an effort that is worth it every single day. Thank you so much.
Take a second. Okay, here we go. Great. Pierre, thank you so much for, so often this conversation is approached in such a narrow, controversial way. To see it situated in the longer history, going back to the origins of humanitarian work is really instructive and help. And I'm really taken by your starting point that there is never a predetermined humanitarian space. Humanitarian space is something that you have to create, and it requires talking with all, but also this principle of neutrality is fundamentally important in order to be effective. And that is, in some sense, all the more challenging for UNRWA in this special case, because, as you point out, that it's unusual in that it was mandated to look after one particular community. And so thank you for your really frank remarks on how that is impacting your work today. I wanted to, I mentioned in my opening some points about IPI's work, and I wanted to ask you a follow-up on that. You mentioned, you started out with some remarks about the changing nature of armed conflict. And one of those differences about conflicts today is the presence of non-state armed groups, violent extremists, and others in conflict environments. IPI's Humanitarian Affairs Program has been doing work on the issue of how counterterrorism and sanctions measures impact humanitarian action. And the Palestinian territories is one of the contexts where that regularly comes up as an object of concern. And so could you speak to how counterterrorism legislation, and in particular the designation of Hamas as a terrorist, foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. and others, how does that impact UNRWA's work in the broader humanitarian response?
So whether it's on issues of legislation or simply just perceptions and political debate, the whole thing is that it's extremely widespread, that governments sometimes and individuals find it difficult that you will operate in a context where one of the actors, right now it doesn't matter how they label them, right? Whether it's terrorist movements or other terminology that is used, are on the opposing side of the conflict. And it's a human experience and it's a political reflex to try and undermine and delegitimize the dialogue that may take place with armed groups on the other side. Now, from my Red Cross experience, I just know that this was the case. For example, I worked during the war in Bosnia in Banja Luka, which was on the Bosnian Serb side. So, of course, people in many cases felt that that was the wrong side to be working on. But the fact was that if we were not working there, we wouldn't have helped thousands of Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Muslims who were caught there. And there was no other way to do that than to engage in dialogue with the Bosnian Serb leadership. We can all have our discussions about whether that's something pleasant to do in life. But if you're looking for something pleasant to do, then you don't go and operate in the heart of conflict zones. As I said, they're ugly, they're messy. I have sat down with plenty of people that I would have never imagined sitting down with. But the key thing is, why am I sitting down with them? What is the rationale behind it? And the rationale is to create access. It's to create sustained operations. You know, my temptation, and I often say this to colleagues, the natural reflex of any human being operating in a conflict zone is not that of being neutral. That is the last thing that is natural in a conflict zone. You have to work hard on that. When I visit prisoners in the Red Cross context, in many conflicts around the world, when you see people who have been tortured and you sit in their cells, the last reflex that is natural in that regard is to come out of the prison and say, I'm neutral, therefore I have nothing to say about what I saw. That's completely counterintuitive. The first thing you want to do is to convene a press conference to denounce what you've seen. But then, after a split second of where you think that may have felt good, and it would allow me to take the moral high ground, the fact is the next day I would no longer be able to do the follow-up work with that same prisoner who relies on the next visit, who wishes to ensure that a family message is received or transmitted to confirm that he is alive or she is alive. And this can only be achieved by being engaged in dialogue with everyone. That's the essence of the Red Cross's work. In the UN family, it's slightly different because first of all, you operate under the same flag as the Security Council. So being neutral in the UN environment doesn't mean exactly the same thing sometimes than operating in the Red Cross environment. We get that. But the principle is the same. And it means our humanitarian work is only possible if we do engage. And so that is the case also in Gaza. Now, we have, of course, security dialogue with Hamas. We have technical engagements, and that is all part, but we do manage it in a way that needs to be well understood as being driven only and strictly by the humanitarian imperative to continue to have access to the people. So I think to both want humanitarian organizations to fulfill their role in conflict zones and sometimes wanting to challenge their ability to do that by all sorts of impediments on the way is certainly something that can be very difficult for us on the ground.
Right, thank you. So neutrality means not taking sides. And I couldn't help when you were speaking think about Kofi Annan's famous distinction between neutrality and impartiality. That neutrality, not taking sides for the UN in the field, doesn't mean neutrality on the principles of the UN Charter.
That's correct.
And you ended with this great example of the education work of UNRWA and its focus on human rights education and in particular gender equality. And this image of the student parliament headed by a 15-year-old girl I find really striking. Another one of IPI's burgeoning areas of work is on women, peace, and security. And so we've been following this issue quite a bit. And as you know, at the Security Council Open Debate in October last year on women, peace, and security, the NGO working group was represented by a Palestinian woman. Very striking testimony. And she stated specifically that the recent funding cuts to UNRWA have disproportionately impacted the lives of Palestinian women. Especially in terms of health and education. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that on the specific gender dimension there, and on any measures that have been taken to mitigate that.
So two things. I liked your reminder of the distinction between the humanitarian neutrality that is required to have access, and the distinction you introduced with in a way, the political neutrality that the UN cannot have when it comes to threats to international peace and security. Mm-hmm. Right? And this is why, by the way, when you work in the Red Cross, you realize that saying you're neutral may not be exactly the same in the Red Cross environment than in the UN environment, precisely because you operate under the parameters of the Charter, which are not about being neutral in the face of injustice, violence, and, again, threats against international peace and security. And here, just as maybe one additional thought before I come to the education, one of the things that I find very striking and that is very important for us to engage in robustly is to recognize, first of all, that many of the fundamentals that we inherited after World War II are under attack. And I'm speaking here about international humanitarian law. We can talk about, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We can talk about the Refugee Convention, certainly the Geneva Conventions. And remember one thing that happened, again, in the context of the post-9/11 environment. We all remember, whether it was in think tanks, in academic institutions, in the media, in political debate, you had a narrative that went like this. In light of these new trends in warfare, and at that time, of course, the reference was to the existence, for example, of groups like Al-Qaeda, and the changing paradigm that they represent, it was said that international humanitarian law was no longer up to date with some of these changes and no longer adapted to the realities of today's conflict environments. And one of my favorite quotes of that time was when people said, the negotiators in 1949, the negotiators who drafted the Geneva Conventions, that are the conventions that apply and design the rules that are applicable to in situations of armed conflict, had not anticipated a world with Al-Qaeda in it, which is probably a fairly accurate description, fairly factual, but not particularly interesting point. Because the negotiators in 1949 had just survived the greatest calamity that mankind had ever inflicted, and this one can underline mankind, had ever inflicted on itself. Everything conceivable in terms of horrors inflicted on humanity had taken place. None of the negotiators needed any additional imagination to know what horrors human beings are able to unleash and inflict on one another, from the Holocaust to many of the other horrors that we heard and are aware of in World War II. And so the Geneva Conventions are the minimal consensus that emerged from that horror. And we were going to take the risk in the post-9/11 environment to say, maybe no longer adapted to some of the challenges we face today. That is an extraordinary assertion. And it shows how short-sighted one can be when thinking about where we came from. And the very fact that institutions like the United Nations, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, all came as legacy from that worst of the horrors that we have inflicted on each other, and we were prepared to give that up in the name of what? Political expediency and others. I think that is a very irresponsible behavior. And I say, in this very time where we have again these types of reflexes on refugee issues and others, it is exactly the moment where we should say no. We have a huge responsibility to protect and preserve that legacy of World War II, because they are fully in spirit and often in law applicable to the challenges that we face today. Now, on the education and the impact in particular on the gender aspect, you know, it is remarkable that we have a central student parliament, 22 elected young boys and girls from Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza, equally divided among boys and girls that represent our 500,000 students throughout the region. And some of them, by the way, came to speak at the last General Assembly. Others will be present at the pledging conference. So when UNRWA speaks about youth engagement, participation, and gender equity in its education system, it is nothing theoretical. It's already in place. It's in practice. And when you hear how some of our very senior female Palestinian staff, for example, the chief of our health program in the Gaza Strip is a very remarkable female medical doctor who shows so much courage under the immense pressure that she has to deal with. And these are all very powerful symbols of what can be achieved through this work. So, of course, every time that you have funding challenges or issues that are at risk, the worry is that it will impact young girls and women predominantly. That's something we're trying to contain and to limit, but it's certainly something that is worth mentioning at a moment where we're preparing for this pledging conference.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I think I feel like I'd keep asking you questions, but I feel that's a bit of a selfish instinct. We've got a full room here, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So we'll open the floor for Q&A. Yes, here in the aisle and back. And we can take a round, maybe 3 questions, and then come back.
Thanks very much. My name is Manik Mehta. I'm a syndicated journalist. We didn't hear much about the financial plight of your organization, particularly after the U.S. withdrawal. Could you give us some information and update us how much money you have and how much you need? It can be limitless, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Yes, here in the center.
Hello, I'm Carlo from the UN Human Security Unit. I wanted to bring up a very hot topic, I guess, in the UN, the HDPN, the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, which I feel UNRWA is already, I guess, preempting us in many ways. I guess my question is, what advice, lessons learned, or best practices does UNRWA have or would like to recommend its colleagues within the UN to really form this sort of like integration between the humanitarian development and peace-building arms? And with the issue of politicization, I feel like this is something that sometimes divides humanitarian development actors. How can we reconcile that between the two sides so that we can really leverage the comparative advantages that we have in this organization?
Great, thank you. And there was one more back there, yes. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Teal Harold. I work for Security Council Report. You spoke about how the development of trust and the perception of being neutral takes time, but how do you and others work around this in the case of urgent humanitarian crises when you don't have that time?
Great, thanks. I think they can respond to that. So we've got funding, humanitarian development nexus, and trust.
Thanks. So on the funding side, the UNRWA, on average in recent years, spends $1.2 billion for all its activities. And we run an education system for 500,000 students, so that's 708 schools that are UNRWA schools throughout the region, 22,000 education staff, schools, principals, teachers, education specialists, psychosocial counselors. They are employed directly. The vast majority of them are Palestine refugees themselves. The same can be said for our health centers. It's 144 primary health care centers for about 8.5 million patient visits a year, and emergency work, in particular in Gaza and in Syria, for about 1.5 million people. And then you can add protection work, microfinance, and I'll spare some of those details. But 1.2 billion is on average over the last 4 years what we have spent. Now, of course, in general, for any humanitarian organization, fundraising is it's a demanding task, because first of all, there are many competing crises, and donors have different areas of priorities, and then in addition, when you're an organization that has been there for a long time, people will turn more to the more recent crisis, something that is new, etc. So that is, of course, a particular struggle. But the decision by the United States to cut $300 million from our funding last year, when you put that in relation to 1.2 billion, you realize that's a very big piece of your income. And because we already had a projected shortfall at the beginning of 2018 of $146 million, That meant that after the US decision, we were looking for 446 million of additional funding. And that's huge. That is existential in terms of the nature of threat. Now, what we did was not to sit back and complain for very long, but we launched a campaign from Gaza initially, and then we took it around the world that we called Dignity is Priceless, and engaged with many other governments, foundations, individuals, and were able to mobilize at the end. We reduced our expenditure by $92 million, and the rest we mobilized in terms of donor funding. And we did manage ultimately to overcome this huge shortfall. And that means 42 countries and institutions increased their funding to UNRWA last year, which is remarkable. And every single pledge that was made to us during the year last year was honored before the 31st of December, also very remarkable. So you could see a very strong solidarity coming forward. Now, solidarity is something fantastic, and we will never forget this amount of generosity and support that came from governments and individuals. But of course, to sustain that is our big task now. So we again adopted a budget that we've kept very conservative for this year at 1.2 billion. That might not sound like a small amount, and it isn't, but what I mean by conservative is no growth. And to say to the donor community, we will continue to show great financial discipline, but please keep your funding levels at the level of 2018. This has worked well between January and the end of May. And now we've entered deficit figures in June. And that's why this pledging conference is so important, to help us bridge until the fall, and then to see how far we get with another event around UNGA. So what is at risk is really, and if you had students here of UNRWA speaking to you, they would tell you why it is such a factor of anxiety for them to not be sure that the school year will open on time. Like many of us in this room, I thought about this many times, and my sons, it would be the same. In many of our countries, if you hear that the school year is delayed, you may think it's fantastic news because the holiday is going to be longer. But you will not find a single Palestinian boy or girl who thinks in that way, because the education received is something that sustains the entire community. It's the one element that remains in terms of the horizon currently, and therefore so important, and that's why we do work very, very hard to overcome this current ongoing significant financial pressure on UNRWA. On the humanitarian and development, you added the peace building nexus. I think where UNRWA can legitimately bring forward lessons and maybe some experiences in the humanitarian development nexus, for sure, and one has to really give credit to the people who in the 1950s designed the organization, because they integrated these two aspects under one roof, as opposed to having it in separate entities, because you do the emergency work, you do the life-saving gesture, but you also have the strong focus on the development through education, microfinance, and all the sort of support, the part of the work that is more geared towards long-term sustaining of the community. And this is something that one really has to recognize. And so this juxtaposition gives a lot of strength, because, for example, during the Gaza conflict in 2014, it was the English teacher in our school that became the shelter manager, because the school was at the end of the school year, it was, of course, a place of learning, but then it moved to a place of shelter. And when the war was over, we rehabilitated the schools and moved them back to being places of learning. And so you can move between these emergency phases and the development phase back and forth. The peace building dimension has, of course, a more political dimension, which certainly does not relate directly to our now mandate, but what we certainly can say we do, and that is very clearly said by many in the region, is that in addition to playing a role in preserving human dignity, we also there's a certain contribution that UNRWA gives to preserving regional stability. That is not yet peace building, but at least in the meantime, it's the preservation of some parameters of stability. The people who say this very explicitly, Majesty the Jordanian King, King Abdullah II, and the foreign minister of Jordan, for example, Ayman Safadi, who will always describe that if 122,000 boys and girls that are in our schools in the kingdom no longer had access to that education, it would become a matter of national stability in Jordan. So those are quotes from them, and I think it indicates some of these parameters. So I think that's what I would say about that. And the building trust and how that works in emergency settings, that is exactly right. And this is one of the very big difficulties that one often faces when going into the early stages of a conflict. You will find that there's very little knowledge of who you are, whether you are arriving in a Red Cross vehicle or in a UN vehicle at the checkpoint. It requires a lot of explanations. So it's not the flag that will simply protect you. There's a bit this other romantic notion that the flag on your vehicle gives you some kind of security. It may over time, but not in the beginning. Very, very clearly, you have a lot of engagement, of briefing, of information sharing, of presenting yourself, of talking to everybody. Because it's not, again, as I said earlier, just a matter of, it's certainly not a matter of the politics, but it's not only a matter of the access, it's also just the physical security of your staff. Over these 28 years that I've worked, I have lost many, many colleagues in UNRWA and in the ICRC and in the Red Cross, Red Crescent environment. And some of them probably we could not have prevented even if we had managed it differently. But some of these situations, if one looks at it again, one would have to probably conclude that not enough was done in terms of outreach, explaining, and others. So a very clear part. Building trust, as I said, is a crucial element of operating in these conflict zones.
Great, thank you. We can do another round. It's all the way in the back.
Thank you. I'm Adam Bastiana from the Israel Policy Forum. Can you speak about any, particularly in the educational sphere of your work, if there are tech or innovation or entrepreneurship initiatives that are a core feature of the educational system?
Sorry, the part of the education system that
focused on innovation, entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Come all the way up front here. Is that yeah? And then, no, sorry, here in the front row, and then George. Yeah.
Thank you. Yael Danieli, International Organization for Victims Assistance. I understand it's not directly the mandate of UNRWA or any other, quotes, neutral mandate. But I'm interested in how the education affects governance. Do you have any data on whether many of these kids who went through the education that you help provide now participate in the leadership of their governments? And they're not only in the education community, but also in political and ideological pursuits.
Great, thank you. And here, George, yeah.
Thank you. George Baumgarten, correspondent here at the UN for Jewish newspapers in North America and other media as far afield as Georgia and Kazakhstan. How do you respond, sir, to the criticism that your educational operations and particularly your textbooks are organized in such a way as to foster hostility on the part of your students toward Israel, toward the other in the adjacent country, and what you think can be done about it, and how would you describe that yourself? Thank you.
Thank you. So on the innovation and the entrepreneurship, so I think there are different ways of putting it. In a very interesting article that was written by an Israeli journalist in the course of this year, it was a study about how important the contribution of UNRWA's education system had been to the many Palestinians who, after receiving the education in the system, went to the Gulf countries and made a very major contribution to the process and the phases of development of the Gulf countries in the 60s and 70s, notably because we had many Palestinians who went to the Gulf countries as teachers. And it's true, I do meet a lot of people in the leadership in the different Gulf countries who will often refer to the fact that they had Palestinian teachers and that they know that some of them had been in UNRWA schools. And so there's a link there, I think, to regional development. So it's not just you acquire the learning and the skills, but you actually can invest it in other things. Now, where we would like very much to be able to put a greater focus is on our technical vocational institutions. We have about 8,000 students a year. When they've come out of our education system, go into a technical vocational professional training centers that exist in Damascus, in Siblin, in Lebanon, but also in Gaza, West Bank, and in Jordan. And one of the biggest challenges in these technical vocational training centers is, of course, to be able to ensure that what they learn as professional skills is adapted to today's expectations in the markets. And here we have improved. There has been innovation. We certainly foster entrepreneurship and have, since 1991, on another one of our programs, dispersed loans through our microfinance program of up to $500 million US, which has very largely benefited women with small businesses and allowed them to reach greater levels of self-reliance and self-sustainability. Now, if we had, it's true, especially in the technical vocational training side, more resources for that, there we could do a better job. I think it would be more innovative, more creative, and would even allow Palestinian youth better opportunities for linking and connecting with the markets. Now, I have to say to this that one of the greatest impediments to that, apart from the funding element, are the political circumstances that we find. So let me give you two examples. One is the one from Lebanon, where Palestinians have very limited access to employment in Lebanon for political and historic reasons. They are excluded from 40 different professions by decree in terms of access to employment, and that is a very major issue. The right to employment is a very big issue. Currently, the government is looking into this and wishes to have improvements in this area. It's something we welcome and want to work with. Take the other end of the spectrum, the Gaza Strip. So right now, UNRWA, as I mentioned as part of our current efforts, distributes food assistance to 1 million people in the Gaza Strip. That's half of the population of Gaza. And I have to tell you that while I am, happy that we can help people in situations of need, that figure of 1 million people receiving food assistance in Gaza is actually an international scandal. Because these are highly educated, extremely business-oriented, very entrepreneurial people. And I have often met heads of household who in front of their family thank me for the food assistance when they used to run their own businesses, when they used to employ 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people and export to Israel and the West Bank and to Europe. And today can no longer do this because of the conflict dynamics, the blockade that has wiped out entire sectors of the Gaza economy. So while we necessarily should focus on creating links to entrepreneurship and innovation, the realities of the markets in the main environments that we operate in do not sustain that logic for the moment because of the conflict dynamics. And this is where a paradigm shift is required. Because I'm actually rather tired to think that we have to invest what amounts, for example, to $80 million needed for the food assistance in Gaza every year, when in fact, that could sustain job creation or other schemes, technical vocational training that would open far better horizons for people. But of course, we do not, certainly clearly not alone, define the parameters of that environment, and this shows you how complex it is to operate in these contexts. The whole issue of our participation, the participation of our students in leadership and whether they take this up. So first of all, what is very unique through the student parliaments, and by the way, in general, UNRWA's education system, is that it contributes to what I find incredibly confident young boys and girls. Now, of course, like in every country, we'll have differences between young people, When I look at many of the students aged 14, 15 that come and speak at international events, I remember myself at their age, and I knew I would never have been able to stand in front of an audience of 200 people and speak about it with their confidence and engagement. So that, I think, in terms of developing their skills, bringing about the confidence in them, showing them that despite all the adversity that they face in life and everything negative that defines their environment, they often say in meetings they do not want the world to see them as victims alone. They know that there's part of their life that is related and defined by being a victim, but they are young people who want to be part of solutions in the future. So it's a young generation that has a lot of potential. Now again, the environment around them isn't particularly conducive to then having this transfer between what you acquire as skills in the UNRWA school environment and then applying them necessarily. That doesn't mean you don't have examples. You have remarkable examples. We met during the recent visit of the Secretary General of the United Nations to one of our schools in Amman. He met with a group of 6 or 7 young women who are all entrepreneurs. One of them created the Arabic equivalent of Amazon, so the book retailing system in the Arab world, the one that is the most successful. She was a young Palestine refugee. She was a student in UNRWA school. So yes, of course, she has taken her leadership skills to very, very productive use. Now then, of course, we will see. There will be others who will go the political route. Others will go, which is, I think, reflecting the reality in many other countries. The biggest problem is this moment where they come out of the UNRWA school and think about what opportunities do I have in life to exercise a job, as we would all like to do in life, and to invest what they have acquired in something that is professional, can sustain their family, because so many parts of the region are affected by conflict, which limits, of course, the opportunity in a more positive sense. But yes, there's thankfully many very, very uplifting examples of what young people coming out of our education system have done. And I can say it very honestly, because it's happened every time. I have never been to an event anywhere in the world where at the end there wasn't somebody raised the arm and said, I'm the son of an UNRWA teacher, I'm the son of an UNRWA health or nurse, or I was a student in UNRWA schools in Ain el-Helwa in Lebanon, and here I am doing my master's degree or PhD, and many of them say, what can I do? It's now time also for me to give something back and everything. There's this connection that is created, I think, that is very remarkable. So the question on fostering hostility towards Israel and what we do about it in the education. So first of all, we use in all of the countries that we operate in, and that is an agreement that exists since the 1950s with UNESCO and the host governments. We use the curriculum of the host government. The whole idea being that when our students study in the UNRWA school and they finish after 9 or 10 years of education in UNRWA, when they then graduate and move into either secondary or high school or beyond in the national system, they can then continue, of course, to be, because they were fully cognizant and knowledgeable about the national curriculum of the context that they study in. So if you take it after Oslo, since the Oslo Agreement, we have used the Palestinian, the PA curriculum in our schools in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip. Now, what happens in this and how do we manage that? What we do every time and every year when the PA issues the new textbooks, we have a committee that is called the Curriculum Framework Review Committee that sits down and reads the thousands of pages of these textbooks. And we measure them against 3 big criteria. 1, political bias. 2, gender representation or misrepresentation. 3, age appropriateness of what is being taught. Now, of course, in all fairness, nobody ever asks us about the gender issues or the age appropriateness. People only ask about the political bias. So let me focus on that. The question of the political content of the textbooks. So it is clear that on average, every year we have about 3% of the pages that we have seen that contain some form of issue that we think is a challenge in relation to UN principles and values. Let me give you an example. When the Palestinian textbook contains maps of Mandate Palestine, on which Israel is not represented, which in itself is not a an issue as long as you specify that it's a mandate Palestine map, which we have in all of our textbooks. In every single country in the world, you have maps from the past, and you specify that it is a map from the past. In that case, it doesn't become a politically sensitive issue. But when it is not specified, we raise with the Palestinian Authority that we have an issue with the fact that this map seems to suggest that there is not the recognition of the existence of Israel, which would be contradicting UN positions, UN values, and principles. And I have said to the Minister of Education in Palestine that I even less understand the fact that it's not specified, since the PLO has recognized the existence of Israel, so it should be absolutely possible to integrate that into the textbooks and the curriculum. So we have these conversations with the Palestinian Ministry of Education. We draw attention to the issues that we think are problematic. I have myself discussed with the prime ministers and ministers of education and specified which pages would not be taught in the UNRWA schools because we think that they reflect contradictions, or they include contradictions with UN values and principles. That means that we are sometimes in disagreement on some of these issues with the Palestinians, something which, by the way, has been even publicly recognized to UNRWA by COGAT in terms of fairness of how we deal with the curriculum issue. Not a very frequent occurrence, but this one we did have. So we take this issue very, very seriously. We are very engaged on preserving the integrity, the neutrality of our education system. Now, of course, I also must say, and I always say to everybody who is interested in the region, for people who are interested in the textbooks and in how curriculum portrays, the national curricula portray the other, I think the only thing that I would request is that people, in all fairness, look at all the curricula of the region, including the Israeli curriculum. If we're interested in peace, if we're interested in being right, then we can look at one side. If we're interested in peace and dialogue between communities, then we should have an interest in all the curricula, because there were very well documented US studies by US academic institutions that studied in the years around 2010, 11, 12, both the Palestinian and the Israeli curriculum. And what they came to as a conclusion is one of the fundamental problems in both is the lack of recognition of the other and of the experiences of the other. And I think here, if again we're really interested in these issues, we should be working on both sides to have much more taken into consideration. And I actually have to say, I give a lot of recognition to our dialogue with the Palestinian Authority on this, because many of the proposals that we have made have actually been taken into account.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're about out of time.
Take 5 minutes if you want.
Yeah. If we can be succinct, we can take one another round of questions then. So, yes, here, please.
I'm sorry. No, it's okay. Okay, Rhonda Haubin, and I do a blog called Netizen Blog, actually at tots.de. And Netizen Blog is the point of the people around the world who see themselves as citizens of the world, as because of the online developments, and how with the computer, it's not just the computer, but it's the people that are significant. And so I just wonder how the internet and the netizens that are possible as part of your work and the school's work, is that a piece of what you can do some work on? And if not, what are the obstacles? And if yes, can you quickly tell us a little bit about that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think, right here, just pass it right there. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's not a question. Pierre, Maher Nasser. I went to UNRWA schools in Ramallah.
That's...
Thank you for confirming my point.
So that we're sure that every time that he speaks, great. Any other questions?
Especially when as successful as Meyer has been. Congratulations to you. Really.
Yeah, one more question here, and then I think John Hirsch, please.
First of all, thank you very, very much for all these insights. Can you say a little bit more about your dialogue with the United States government? I mean, you made a big point of the centrality, the importance of UNRWA, and then you highlighted this huge cut in U.S. funding. Do you, what is their argument, and how do you answer that argument? And do you see any prospect at all during the Trump administration of a reversal of U.S. policy toward UNRWA?
A big one to the end with there. I think with the,
Thank you. So let me start with, there were two things that I found interesting in your angle. One is on the citizens of the world, and the other is the internet and schools. So first of all, if we had, if you had an opportunity to meet some of the students in UNRWA schools, first of all, there's nothing more extraordinary about the work that we do than that. So, I've worked, as I said, as was mentioned, for many years in conflict zones, but I had never had the experience of doing actual education work, because it's not something the Red Cross does in that way, though they're becoming more interested in it today. But and frankly, you don't find it in other organizations in this way. And it was my biggest discovery, because why is it so important? Because when you do humanitarian work in general, and now I'm oversimplifying, so you'll forgive me for it. When you look at people in a conflict zone, you have the injured, you have the displaced person, the prisoner, whoever else. You will, first of all, by providing medical support, food assistance, water, or whatever else you provide, you look at the person as a victim of a situation. Victim of violence, victim of war, victim of abuse, you can list it. Now, we all know that if we're very, very honest, we would never like to be at the receiving end of assistance that is driven only by the act of being seen as a victim. First of all, because it misrepresents the reality of what happens in conflict zones long before the international humanitarian actor has arrived. The neighbor, the family member has responded. So humanitarian work doesn't start when the Red Cross or the UN vehicle arrives. Many things happen long before that. But when you look at the person as a victim first and foremost, it defines a relationship in one way. And I'm not saying that it's wrong, it's just, that's how it defines, and one has to be very careful how one manages that. In the UNRWA case, that exists also, but when you look at a student and you think of education, you're not looking at a young boy and young girl as a victim. You first of all look at him or her as an actor, a potential actor of his or her own destiny. And that's a completely different paradigm from the victim-focused. And in the case of Palestinian students, what is so remarkable, on the one hand, it's very tough, and on the other hand, it's very remarkable. The tough side is that Palestinian students should be entitled to a future that is defined by contributing to building up a state of their own. Because each and every one of us in this room, in one way or another, had the pride to contribute to the development of our country, to the development of our own institutions. Now, some of us have chosen the global line of work, but others have acted nationally. And Palestinian boys and girls in our schools don't have that. And since they are denied for the time being of being citizens of a state of their own, what we always say is nobody can take away from them that they are citizens of this world, and therefore global citizens. And therefore you will hear from them and from others that they want to contribute to the SDGs. They want to contribute to solutions around the world. They want to be seen as actors. They want to be recognized for their skills, capabilities, and not just seen as part of a problem in the region, a burden on everybody. People who are first of all thought of associations through what we talked about earlier, terrorism here and others. So young boys and girls like us, every one of them. And so we should act decisively to enable that. And the internet element, of course, allows for greater connections, a better understanding of what's happening. But you know how that is also, there are two sides to that coin, right? There's the good side of being connected, and then there's the difficult side. If you're in Gaza, you can be better connected with the outside, but you also understand everything that you're being denied. Right? You're not allowed to move out of Gaza. You cannot leave. You cannot go anywhere. You don't have jobs. You don't have a horizon. But you can see it all the better on the internet. So I think we always have to think about these two sides. Now, of course, one could design an internet-based market in Gaza. That would be desirable, but then should I say to somebody, since you're not allowed to leave here, let me design an internet-based market for you? So, we have to address the underlying political circumstances for this to change. But the one example I wanted to give you about how one can make and put both television and internet to very good use in education is in the war in Syria. Before the war in Syria, we had 100 schools in UNRWA for about 60,000 students. And about half of those schools were either damaged or destroyed during the war. So many children could no longer access a school building to receive education. So we found other ways of bringing the education, self-learning materials and others, very innovative ways. But one was that we had our teachers in Gaza produce education materials, content, through television and now on the internet, that was broadcast from our television station in Gaza. There is such a thing as an UNRWA. There was such a thing as an UNRWA television station in Gaza. We now do it internet-based. And that young boys and girls in Syria were using, and not just Palestinians, of course, because it was accessible to many others. And last year, and there's no direct correlation between the 2 points I'm going to make now, but last year there's a young Palestinian girl, Aya Abbas, 15 years old, who was the highest performing student in the national exams in Syria. So first of all, you'd be forgiven for not knowing that there are still national exams in Syria, but it is a Palestinian student, a young girl who got the highest marks. She was born in Yarmouk camp, which is a place totally destroyed by the war. She had to flee this camp at a young age with her parents. She lived in shelters elsewhere, and she became the highest performing student because of the education that was preserved. So when we say leave no one behind, we really mean it. It's not lip service, it's nothing abstract, it's something we're deeply committed to. And in that sense, I think innovation, trying to find new ways to preserve that access is important. So the dialogue with the US government. So first of all, it's historically been a hugely important relation. The US was the single largest, most generous, most active donor to UNRWA, and that's why the decision, of course, came as a disappointment last year. And it was in particular a disappointment because it was not related to our performance. If you're working with a donor who says you're not transparent enough, or the quality of your education has gone down, or we don't like what's happening in your health centers, you're not producing the kinds of results that you're supposed to, and we will hold back on our funding until you have improved, that's a normal conversation with a donor. We had just signed a new cooperation framework agreement with the United States in December 2017. And 6 weeks later, $300 million were cut from our funding. And that was mainly because of the tensions and disagreements between the US government and the Palestinian leadership following the announcement on Jerusalem and the announcement that they were going to move the embassy. This led to a very strong polarized phase. Now, one can say in all honesty, it was not the first time in the history that there was a disagreement between the United States government and the Palestinian leadership. But this one translated into very strong and harsh measures of pressure on the Palestinian leadership in financial terms. And for the first time ever, it included humanitarian funding as measures of pressure. And this brings us back to the topic of this discussion. That's a politicization of humanitarian funding that should never happen. And by the way, in the US had never happened because there was always a bipartisan consensus on preserving this type of humanitarian funding to international humanitarian organizations, including to UNRWA. So I would say these are the parameters of the situation. I don't, in that sense, expect any change at this point or reversal of the decision. We are, of course, engaged in dialogue with the United States. We have an office in Washington. Our director engages on the Hill, engages in the State Department and others. So, of course, we do keep also the investment and the contacts, and we'll build relations for the mid to longer term. That is absolutely essential. In the meantime, we'll focus on trying to mobilize the money from the other partners and then see how this dialogue develops. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I think that actually is a great wrap-up conclusion to this. And I really want to thank you. It was an extraordinary combination of big thinking and a concrete briefing on a really fundamentally important topic for us all today. And I come back to this point about that humanitarian space needs to be created. It's not just there, and it's striking that after 70 years, UNRWA is still fighting for that space. And so we wish you the best of good fortune, to use that word, perhaps, in the next couple of weeks. And we'll hope you'll come back again sometime soon.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you very much.